We're thrilled that you are taking time out of your day to join us today. And we are quite pleased to be able to have André Gremillet to guide us through today's conversation. He was named as Executive Director of the Cleveland Orchestra in June 2015 and became President and CEO in 2018. He came to us from Melbourne, Australia, where he served as Managing Director of the Melbourne Symphony Orchestra. He was known as a leader with a record of rescuing orchestras in trouble, which is what happened in Melbourne and previously in New Jersey. Not quite so with Cleveland Orchestra, which of course is world-renowned and a model of excellence. As André said when he assumed this role, my role is to build further. We can't take the success of the last few years for granted. He was charged with safeguarding and spreading a world-class reputation, and he has done just that. In his short time with us, he has increased the endowment, turned a deficit around, cultivated new audiences, both outside and inside Severance Hall, and managed residencies in Miami, Vienna, and led world tours. He's a trained pianist and described as a thoughtful and perceptive leader. I would say he's a change agent whose skills are called upon now more than ever before as the orchestra navigates totally uncharted territory. He's a proud member of the Leadership Cleveland class of 2018, and we're thrilled to have him with us at noontime today. André?
Thank you, Marianne, and good afternoon. Good afternoon, everyone. Yes, indeed, the times that we're in, that wasn't part of the job description when I signed on a little over 4 years ago. But this is where we're at, and I thought I would give you a brief overview on what we've been doing since the beginning of this pandemic and what we're looking at going forward. So just a brief summary, because it seems like ages ago already, but it was only a few months ago that the world stopped for us, as for so many institutions. So we played our last concert on March 13th. We decided to stop playing basically 24 hours before the governor told us so, because we just felt that it was simply too risky for all of our stakeholders. And for us, it was already kind of a second, huge decision like this, because we had to cancel a European and Abu Dhabi tour about 2 weeks earlier. And of course, as you would remember, the virus first was spreading in these locations before it came to us. So what did that mean for us at the time? Of course, huge losses, like so many institutions. We quickly put a 6-month cash plan together. Our fiscal year ends at the end of June, and we were doing quite well until then, but turned around, put this plan together, and quickly assessed that under realistic assumption that turned out to be true, we would be losing about $12 million between March and the end of September. And we're talking about the Cleveland Orchestra operating a budget of roughly $55 million a year. So very promptly, and I have to say, we've heard this, this kind of cliche by now that we're all in this together, but I think the Cleveland Orchestra from very early on, put that to test in terms of trustees, musicians, staff, and our donor community really coming in together very strongly, and that made a big difference for us. And we established from the start some kind of guiding principles. And the first one, not surprisingly, was to make sure that we preserve the institution. And preserving the institution doesn't just mean, remaining alive, but in the case of an institution like the Cleveland Orchestra, it really meant making sure that we got out of this crisis intact in a way that would not jeopardize our long-term future. And of course, given the uncertainty and of this pandemic and how long it might or might not last, it was a very important point from the beginning. The second guiding principle, intimately connected to the first one, was to make sure that we took care of our people. The Cleveland Orchestra is like so many institutions, but even perhaps more so than many, about its people, right? To give you a sense, more than 2/3 of our expenses are labor costs. The people are the orchestra, whether the musicians on stage, whether the staff, and to make sure that that we emerge from this crisis intact, we have to make sure that we take care of our people, that we protect them, protect their employment as much as we possibly can. And these two guiding principles really have led the way as we looked at all of this. The third point I would mention is something that I've been really adamant about from the start, is trying to utilize this crisis to move the strategy forward. And that may seem a little bit counterintuitive at times, but we have a very clear strategic plan. We spend a lot of time at the Cleveland Orchestra, enunciating a vision, implementing that vision. And from the very beginning, we looked at, okay, this is really bad. It's going to be tough. It's going to be long. Still, how can we use this crisis to accelerate some of the very important strategic objectives that we have? And if we look at the next slide, Catherine, this is how we started approaching what we did, right? So we couldn't play, we couldn't perform, so the musicians went home. And we quickly pivoted on bringing some content online. And this was very much the continuation of something that we started a few years ago, which really a renewed emphasis on content marketing. The Cleveland Orchestra, known as the best in this country, one of the best in the world. And really for us, the long-term vision is how do we keep developing the circle, the number of people who support us, not just in Ohio, but all around the world. And obviously online content is really, really important. So what we did was to expand some of the programs we were already doing, mindful music moments, which is something we've put in place in dozens and dozens of schools all over Ohio. We started some living room concerts from our musicians who really were adamant to continue playing, even though they could not perform as an ensemble. And they started recording all these performances from home that you can see online. We came to an agreement with our longtime partners, WCLV and Idea Stream, to have a new radio series every day, lunchtime with the Cleveland Orchestra. And we started this new TCO Classics series on our website from the archives. And the last point where, the last item on a personal note, and I'll play a clip, a very brief clip in a second, was something we had been talking about for quite a while, developing a podcast series to, again, tell the story of the Cleveland Orchestra, right? It's one thing to say we're great and we've been great for a long time, but what really is much more powerful than quoting the New York Times about what we do is giving people greater access to the musicians and to the artists behind the music making. And this podcast, which was in the works, is an example of something that we greatly accelerated. And I'll just play for you a quick 30-second clip that gives you a sense of what we tried to do with this first season of this podcast. Catherine?
From the Cleveland Orchestra, this is On a Personal Note, a new weekly podcast in which musicians share their most intimate, emotional stories about the music.
In a situation which all of us, we have never experienced. You want to hang on to something you love.
A new episode of On a Personal Note is released every week. Learn more at clevelandorchestra.com/podcast.
So this podcast was launched on April 9. So as you can see, we moved very quickly on this. And the first episode, if you haven't listened to it, please have a look, or have a listen rather, featured Franz Welzheimer, our music director, really narrating how he felt through the last concert of the season, which we ended up playing without an audience on that Thursday night and Friday morning, because we wanted to record the piece live that we had planned on recording and issuing a new recording. And it was a bit of a surreal experience as the orchestra performed with, myself and a handful of my colleagues in the audience. And it was really a powerful moment. And it gave us an opportunity to really personalize Franz and give a sense of people who may not know him as well as I do, of the man behind that story. So a highly emotional story And the rest of the series has been more or less on that same vein, kind of having one musician per podcast telling his or her story around a piece of music. And if you are not a subscriber to this series, I really encourage you to go and have a listen. It's something new for us, and it's been extremely successful, more than 16,000 downloads. And overall, all of these efforts on social media that we've made since mid-March have resulted in about 7 million more people accessing our content online worldwide. So we had about 20 million people last year, which was already a record from the year before, and we increased that to close to 27 million people. So that's an example of something that, again, had to happen and really happened more quickly because of this crisis. Moving on to the next slide, education is a huge part of what we do. So we've been using this time to put all of our educational content online, and you're seeing the examples of that right now. Very important, especially as we look at the next season. And then on the next slide is something that we're especially proud of because it is an initiative that was fully conceived and executed by our musicians. So our musicians went home. We implemented salary cuts across the board, negotiated with the musicians union. It went very promptly. But here they were, home with, still quite a good salary despite the cuts, and eager to come back to work. And many of them, made these videos, provided all these content. And then 4 of our musicians, Catherine Borman, Jolyn Park, Lynn Ramsey, and Isabel Trotwine, decided to do something for our healthcare workers. They contacted the 3 medical centers in Cleveland and put together a group of concerts of 20 performances featuring about 50 of our musicians. And they played at Metro Health, at the clinic, and at UH. And it was incredibly well received, as you can imagine, from our heroes working in these medical centers. And it showcased once again the relevance of the Cleveland Orchestra, And I do want to point out once again that, it wasn't my team telling the musician to do this. It was their initiative. And basically they came to us for support once it was launched. And on the next slide, you see such an example of a performance like this. So if we move forward to the next slide, basically the way we approached that $12 million gap that I mentioned was threefold. The first one was to reduce the costs. So we reduced the cost by having these salary cuts, which amounted to about $3.5 million across the board, musicians and staff. We quickly did some fundraising with the board. So the board came up with about $3 million in a very brief amount of time, supplemental funding, with a $3 million challenge to the community, which we launched in the form of a preservation fund. And it was quite sensitive to go and fundraise in this environment, for, let's face it, what is still a non-essential cause. The Cleveland Orchestra is not saving lives or putting food on the table. So we were very sensitive to our environment, to acknowledging the needs in the community, yet we had an institution and we had an institution to save. So we went with this challenge out there, and we've been very successful. Our message has been carefully calibrated. Many people are not able to give to us or choose not to give to us because they feel that there are more important causes out there, and we obviously respect that. But still, we've been very proactive with this, and we've raised, of the additional $3 million, we've raised about $5.6 million of that. So of 6, so 2.6 of the 3 million. And that's only the beginning because, as I mentioned, this is all about the first 6 months of this pandemic, if you will. But the result of that was a significant increase in number of donors for us this fiscal year, which again is a bit ironic given the crisis. But this effort made it possible for more people to give to us than ever before in terms of total number of donors. And that's something that we want to build on. If we look at the next slide, some of the major themes that we put forward as we fundraise for this, explaining to people, why we were in such a bind. obviously the cancellation of concerts and of income that came with that. But also putting very clearly the message forward that we were helping ourselves first before asking for help from the institution, right? Whether it was the wage reductions or whether it was the contribution from our board, we did that first before asking for funding, and really kind of weaving in the messaging that we have a 103-year-old institution here that is incredibly important to this city and this state, and we need to save it. And this is arguably the greatest crisis that this institution has ever faced in 103 years. And so far, I have to say, it's been very well received. If we look at the next couple of slides here, we've linked that to our online content. And then on the following slide, we really had a few messages in terms of communication, again, being very clear about what we were trying to do, why it was essential. And to give you a sense, for those of you who don't know how our deeply flawed business model works, we're dependent for about 65% of our annual revenue on donations, on contributed revenue. So some of it is endowment income, but most of it is philanthropic sponsorship, foundation revenue. So this is our bread and butter, and this is why this pandemic is especially difficult for us and risky, because as people are facing an economic crisis, clearly donations go down in a significant way. I think the last slide I have is a really very moving card from a young person who sent us a small donation following our request here. But it's been really heartwarming to get a sense of how much we mean for this institution, and how valued we are, and a reminder that we can't take this for granted, which brings me briefly to the plan for the coming months, and then I'll be happy to take questions. What we've been working on, in addition to all of this, of course, has been to plan for this coming season. So we had, of course, a 2021 season fully in place, fully booked, tickets on sale and all of this. And with this extreme uncertainty, it's been very difficult to plan for the season. So what we've been doing is basically making some assumptions and remaining as flexible as we possibly can. So we are working with the assumption that as of early October, so we'll start our season a little bit later, we'll be able to have a group of about 50 musicians on stage, which we think, working closely with Cleveland Clinic, is something that's possible. And that we will have an audience at the most of 400 people. We may also very likely not have an audience at all, at least for the fall. So we've been working on streaming our concerts live every week, starting in the fall. And again, back to my earlier point, this was part always of the long-term vision for the Cleveland Orchestra since I've been here, which is to provide a fully digital experience, live experience for people in Ohio, in this country, and around the world. So we're basically accelerating this very important initiative. As a first step, it will be much simpler than the longer-term vision, but the goal by October is that all of you who are subscribers or donors will be able to access our concerts online. They will be shorter, an hour-long concerts, so that if we have people live, there will be no intermission, safer for the audience. That will be, of course, socially distanced in the hall. And the idea is to offer as much value and as much product as we possibly can. And of course, we're fully aware that, especially over the past few weeks, as the situation got worse in Ohio, that this may be called to change. But our premise with all of this is that we believe that our best odds, if you will, of securing and returning as much revenue as possible for next season is to do everything we possibly can to bring music to our audiences. And then if we can't, because of health reason, which of course will trump everything else, then so be it. But I think that our audiences and our donors will reward us for doing everything we possibly can to bring them our music. Because my assumption and our premise is that there's a limit to goodwill. You know, people will stop donating if they don't get our music. And quite frankly, our music is probably needed more than ever right now with what's going on in the world, and we're hearing from people. I think I'll pause here. I'm seeing some questions, and I'll take a sip of water as I have a look.
André, thank you so much. We have had some questions come in. So to start thinking about some of the funding challenges, were you able to apply or receive any of the federal funding? And how did you handle ticket refunds and donations?
So yes, I failed to mention, one of the first steps we did as we planned together was to apply for a PP loan. And we got over $5 million in the first round of this. And we believe we got 5.5. We believe that 5 million will be forgiven. We meet those guidelines very clearly. So that's been a big part of bridging that gap, in addition to the fundraising and the salary cuts. Ticket refunds, we offered full refunds for the concert that were canceled at the end of the year, but more than 50% of the ticket buyers donated their tickets back, which is, again, that's Cleveland for you. Incredibly generous population, and it's made a big difference for us. And of course, we'll do the same. We've sold about $3 million of subscriptions for this coming season. And if people are not satisfied with what we have to offer, of course, I'll be able to get a refund. But again, we're hoping that people will see value in what we have to offer.
Can you share a little bit about the decision to cancel the Blossom season, especially as people talk a lot about being outdoors and that being some of the safer options? What was some of the thought that went into canceling the Blossom season for this summer?
Well, the most important element, and we waited as long as we could, to make that decision as well, is that we simply could not get the people on stage. So even if you can have a socially distanced audience, if you can have an orchestra, it defeats the purpose. So it was a driving point here, as opposed to the fall where we think it will be possible to have, because we know more about the virus, because we know more of what's possible or not, and because of the work we're doing with the Cleveland Clinic. So, but it was a tough decision because, Blossom is so incredibly important for us. And also from the business perspective, we get half of our paying audience every year comes from Blossom, even though we only play a fifth of the concerts there. So Blossom is not our second venue. Blossom is first among equals with Severance.
As you think about the musicians and not being able to do something that they love so much, how do you help keep their morale high through all of the uncertainty of these times?
It's a great point. We speak a lot, and many of you run businesses or are part of businesses facing the same challenges. I found that one of the silver lining of this crisis is that the communication through Zoom, through these kind of forums, is actually quite effective. And we're finding that our staff meetings, which we have way more often now given this crisis, and our all orchestra meetings, people are way more engaged, ask more questions, participate in a better way and more meaningful way. So we've been using this, but we're keeping a good eye on everybody, people who live alone. And if you're an artist and you live for your art and you can't perform for months, it's especially tough. So we have, mental health services available for them. Obviously, our HR team is speaking to them. And we try to keep in touch as much as we can. But it's been tough. They can't wait to be back. They really can't. You don't win a job in a Cleveland Orchestra to stay home. It doesn't matter whether you have a good part of your salary. This is not why you're here.
So as you think about the past few months, what has been your biggest challenge to date? And what do you see as your biggest challenge going forward?
Well, to date, it's been keeping the place afloat. I mean, the Cleveland Orchestra, like most orchestras, is not exactly, flush in money here. It's always a challenge. We live off donations. Our endowment, should be much greater than it is. So it's always been challenging financially. Marianne made a reference to a few years of deficit until last year. So when you have very little margin, it's nerve-wracking, obviously. So making sure that you stay afloat, making sure you keep your people. As I said, we're all about our people. And while people may have limited options now, when things get better, people will keep getting options, and we want to make sure we keep our great people. Going forward, the biggest challenge is how much of this crisis is going to change our industry forever. And that's something I spent a lot of time thinking about. And I think some of the ways might be for the better, actually, if we're thinking about this way of engaging people online. But, how will touring be affected? I've already canceled 2 tours in 6 months. We were going to go in March. We were going to go back in October. In my opinion, touring as we know it will change significantly going forward. What does that mean for us? What does that mean for an audience? We have a very young audience and we have a very old audience. That's how we get to our medium age that we currently have. What does that mean for older people who may not be coming back to the hall for a very long time until they feel absolutely safe? What are the implications revenue-wise? So all of these are big, big kind of existential questions. At the same time, the digital work that I referred to is moving more quickly than we ever dreamt it would because of necessity, which is, so how do we, pivot even more quickly to a model that, while remaining first and foremost live, makes the most of the online. And when you have a global brand like we do, there are huge opportunities out there with what we can do online.
So as we here on the call look to see how we can support the Cleveland Orchestra, what are some ways that those who are interested can support the work of the orchestra and your musicians?
Well, I think it's if you can kind of communicate some of what I mentioned is very important. I mean, I think it's very important people to know that as we're raising money, as we're asking people to keep donating, even though they will not be receiving the same kind of concert experience they would, that we're taking care of our people. And I think that means a lot to people in general. We have other orchestras, and I'm sure they didn't have a choice, who've put their musician on unemployment, people who can no longer afford to live in cities because, like, we're not doing this. And we're working really hard not to have to do this because, again, our people are the institution. So people to know that their dollars are put to good use, but also that we're doing a lot, as much as we possibly can, for the community in terms of our educational program. We're not reducing these in any way. On the contrary, if anything, going online like we're doing is going to help kind of further the access because we think it's that important and we don't want to, reduce our mission in any way. But I guess the last point I would make is, for the community not to take us for granted as well. I mean, it is that serious. I mean, this institution, like so many others, could not survive this crisis. I mean, it's highly possible. And that just can't happen. And it's too important for Cleveland, it's too important for the world. And we need all the support that this community can afford.
Well, Andre, we thank you for the time that you shared with us today and for all the work that you and the team are doing to maintain the Cleveland Orchestra, which is just such a gem here in Cleveland. And we look forward to a time when we can come back together for the live music experience.
Thank you so much. Nice to see all of you. Thank you.
And with that, I welcome back Marianne.
Thank you, Rachel, and thank you, Andre. That was just tremendous insights into all that you're doing and to be innovative with music. And we hope that more people will take advantage of the digital offerings and fall in love with the Cleveland Orchestra like so many on this call already have. So we're grateful for your leadership. Thank you.